In September 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland and war spread across Europe, Britain immediately understood that its survival would depend not only on what happened on land, but on what happened far out at sea, in the cold and unforgiving waters of the Atlantic Ocean. As an island nation, Britain relied completely on maritime supply lines. From North America, hundreds of merchant ships carried food, oil, steel, and weapons across more than 4,000 miles of rough ocean to reach ports like Liverpool, Glasgow, and Bristol. These convoys were the country's lifeline. If they were cut off, Britain would soon run out of food, its factories would shut down, and its army would be unable to fight. Germany's leaders understood this well. Hitler believed that Britain could be defeated without invasion, simply by starving it into submission. He gave that task to Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, whose submarines were seen as the key to winning control of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, though still regarded as the strongest in the world, was not prepared for this new kind of warfare. Many of its ships were outdated relics from the First World War, lacking modern sonar or radar. Merchant vessels often sailed with little or no escort, moving slowly through fog and freezing waters, the perfect hunting ground for U-boats lying in wait. Within just a few months, hundreds of ships had been sunk. Torpedoes struck in the darkness, explosions shattered the calm night, and then the ocean closed again, leaving only burning oil slicks and scattered debris. Some ships were lost within sight of Britain's coastline. Every morning, newspapers reported new sinkings, new losses, and more sailors who never came home. This was the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, a struggle without clear front lines, without glory, fought day after day amid fear, endurance, and silence. It would last nearly 6 years and decide whether Britain could survive long enough to continue the fight against Nazi Germany. Night of September 3rd, 1939. In the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the British passenger ship SS Athenia was heading toward Canada. Earlier that same day, Britain had declared war on Germany following the invasion of Poland. On board were more than 1,000 people, most of them civilians fleeing Europe to escape the coming conflict. The sea was calm, the night quiet. No one imagined that war had already reached them. Not far away, the German submarine U-30 moved silently beneath the waves. Through the periscope, Captain Fritz Julius Lemp spotted a large, unescorted vessel showing no flag. Believing it to be a British merchant ship, he gave the order to fire. Moments later, a powerful explosion tore through the night. The Athenia shuddered violently, smoke and fire rising from the engine room. Panic spread among the passengers as distress signals crackled through the radio. The ship slowly began to sink, taking more than 100 lives, most of them women and children. The attack on the SS Athenia became the first shot of the Battle of the Atlantic, marking the beginning of a long and deadly struggle at sea. By mid-September 1939, another German submarine ambushed the British aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal off the British Isles. The torpedoes were launched but detonated prematurely due to technical failure, allowing Ark Royal to escape. The escorting destroyers immediately counterattacked, dropping a barrage of depth charges. The U-39 was destroyed with all hands, the first German U-boat lost in the war. 3 days later, the situation reversed. On September 17, 1939, while patrolling west of Ireland, the British aircraft carrier HMS Courageous was struck by 2 torpedoes from U-29. Explosions ripped through the hull, and within minutes, the massive ship sank, taking more than 500 sailors with it. The U-29 slipped away safely. In just the first week of the war, the Royal Navy had lost a carrier, a blow that shocked the entire nation. October 1939. In northern Scotland, the Royal Navy's Scapa Flow base, considered one of Britain's safest harbors, was quiet as usual. But that night, the German submarine U-47, commanded by Günther Prien, exploited a gap in the defenses, and crept inside the anchorage. Through the periscope, Prien saw the silhouette of the battleship HMS Royal Oak lying still at anchor. He gave the order to fire. 3 explosions tore through the darkness, and flames lit the surface of the harbor. Royal Oak took fatal damage, rolled over, and sank within minutes, carrying nearly 800 sailors to their deaths. The U-47 escaped undetected before the British could react. When news of the attack spread, Europe was stunned. In Germany, Prien was celebrated as a national hero. In Britain, fear and disbelief gripped the Royal Navy. They now understood that the enemy could strike anywhere, even inside their most secure harbor. In the final months of 1939, fighting in the Atlantic was still scattered but increasingly violent. In the South Atlantic, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee roamed freely, hunting Allied merchant ships. Within weeks, it had sunk 9 vessels with a total of over 50,000 tons of cargo, shaking the Allies' shipping routes. The Royal Navy sent several warships in pursuit. In December 1939, near the River Plate estuary between Argentina and Uruguay, 3 British cruisers finally intercepted and engaged the Graf Spee. After several hours of fierce gunnery exchange, the German ship was heavily damaged and forced to take refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay. Trapped and unable to escape, Captain Hans Langsdorff ordered his crew to scuttle the ship 3 days later rather than let it fall into British hands. Thick smoke rising over Montevideo marked the end of the Graf Spee's short but intense campaign. As winter 1939 to 1940 set in, the Atlantic temporarily quieted. Icy storms swept across the ocean, coating ship decks in frost and testing both sides' endurance. At that time, Germany had only about 50 operational U-boats, many of them small and limited to coastal waters. Their deployment into the open ocean came with heavy risks. Some were trapped in northern ice, others were forced to return to base due to fuel shortages. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy recovered from its early losses and reorganized. The convoy system, groups of merchant ships escorted by armed warships, was reinstated, just as it had been in World War I. Merchant vessels sailed in formation, surrounded by destroyers and escort ships, ready to respond to any threat. Occasionally, distant explosions from German magnetic mines broke the stillness, but overall, the early months of 1940 passed without major engagements. Both sides were preparing for a longer struggle. By the summer of 1940, the situation changed dramatically. France had fallen to Nazi Germany, giving Hitler control of the Atlantic coast. Strategic ports, such as Brest, Lorient, and La Rochelle, were converted into submarine bases, allowing U-boats to operate deep into the North Atlantic without the limits of range or fuel. At the same time, Italy entered the war on the Axis side, forcing Britain to divert naval forces to the Mediterranean. Many British destroyers had already been lost or damaged during the Norwegian campaign and the Dunkirk evacuation, leaving convoy escorts dangerously thin. The moment had come for Admiral Karl Dönitz and his wolf packs. Beginning in July 1940, reports reached London that convoys leaving Canada and the United States had vanished at sea. Across the fog-covered ocean, columns of fire marked where ships had been hit by torpedoes. At night, U-boats surfaced under cover of darkness, weaving between convoy formations to fire torpedoes and deck guns. Explosions echoed through the waves. Flashes of fire lit the night, and oil burned on the water. Escort ships hunted desperately but were handicapped by primitive technology. Long-range radar was still in testing, and ASDIC sonar could not detect submarines when they surfaced. The U-boats struck quickly and disappeared into the dark, leaving only wreckage and drifting oil behind. Dönitz's wolf pack tactic proved devastating through September and October 1940. A typical example came in mid-October, when convoy SC-7, consisting of more than 30 merchant ships en route to Britain, was ambushed by around 7 U-boats in mid-Atlantic. Over 2 nights, the submarines attacked from multiple directions. Red flares lit the sky, but the escorts were overwhelmed. One after another, ships were hit and broken apart by torpedoes, sinking into the deep with their crews and cargo. More than half of SC-7 was wiped out in a single night. A few days later, convoy HX-79 met the same fate in another coordinated assault. Between June and October 1940, the Germans had sunk roughly 270 Allied ships, a staggering figure. In ports across Britain, the surviving merchant vessels limped home with scorched hulls, their crews telling grim stories of the wolf packs that ruled the Atlantic. In Germany, a string of victories had turned U-boat commanders into national heroes. Newspapers praised them as the men in gray who had brought Britain to its knees. But across the Channel, the situation was dire. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later admitted, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." By the winter of 1940, Britain was facing the risk of being cut off completely. To survive, the Allies had to adapt quickly. Convoys were reorganized into larger, better protected formations, reducing the number of isolated ships. Although the United States had not yet officially entered the war, it began providing support. In September 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the transfer of 50 old destroyers to Britain in exchange for leases on several Atlantic bases. These ships, once refurbished, joined the escort fleets. The Royal Air Force increased maritime patrols, but aircraft range at the time still left a black gap in the central Atlantic, a zone beyond the reach of land-based air cover. Gradually, hard-earned experience began to pay off. Convoy commanders refined zigzag maneuvers to evade torpedoes and took the initiative to hunt U-boats rather than wait to be attacked. Meanwhile, a silent battle of code-making and code-breaking was underway, a struggle that would eventually tip the balance. Yet by early 1941, the advantage still lay firmly with the U-boats. The year 1941 began with both danger and new hope. In the first months, Germany also deployed surface raiders into the Atlantic. In January and February, the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau launched Operation Berlin, slipping into the Atlantic to attack Allied convoys. They managed to sink over 20 isolated merchant ships, but most organized convoys escaped thanks to the Royal Navy's rapid response. Eventually, under heavy pursuit, both German ships retreated to Brest, France. The giants of the surface fleet had achieved little and were now forced into hiding. Meanwhile, the undersea war was beginning to shift. In early March 1941, the British convoy OB-293 detected signs of nearby U-boats. Its escorts, now equipped with the new centimetric radar, chose to strike first. On the night of March 7th, the destroyer HMS Wolverine attacked with a barrage of depth charges. Moments later, explosions rocked the water. The U-47, commanded by Günther Prien, the man who had sunk Royal Oak in Scapa Flow, never surfaced again. Weeks later, during the defense of convoy HX-112, British escorts scored 2 more major victories. The U-100 under Joachim Schepke was detected by radar aboard HMS Vanek while surfacing at night and was rammed and sunk. Almost simultaneously, U-99, commanded by the famed Otto Kretschmer, was severely damaged by depth charges and forced to surface. Kretschmer and his crew were captured. In just 1 month, March 1941, Nazi Germany lost 3 of its most skilled U-boat commanders. For the first time, the men guarding the convoys began to believe that with persistence, improved tactics, and growing cooperation, they might finally turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. In May 1941, the Atlantic was shaken once more, this time not by submarines, but by a steel giant on the surface. The German battleship Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, was ordered to break into the Atlantic and strike at Britain's supply lines, Operation Rheinübung. On May 19th, Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen quietly departed the Baltic and headed toward the open ocean. When news reached London, the Admiralty was stunned. A 50,000-ton warship armed with 8 380mm guns was now loose in the shipping lanes. At dawn on May 24th, in fog-covered waters near Iceland, Bismarck encountered 2 British warships, the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, in the Denmark Strait. Both sides opened fire almost simultaneously. After just a few salvos, a shell from Bismarck pierced Hood's magazine, triggering a massive explosion. In less than 3 minutes, the Royal Navy's most famous ship broke in two and sank, taking 1,415 men with her. Only 3 survived. The Prince of Wales was badly hit and forced to retreat under a smokescreen. Bismarck, though leaking fuel from a shell hole below the waterline, remained operational. The loss of Hood sent shockwaves through Britain. Admiral John Tovey issued a single urgent order: sink the Bismarck at all costs. For the next 3 days, more than 50 British warships and several squadrons scoured the Atlantic. Bismarck attempted to reach a safe harbor in France, but her fuel leak betrayed her position. On the night of May 26th, aircraft from the carrier HMS Ark Royal attacked through heavy anti-aircraft fire. A single torpedo struck the ship's rudder, jamming it and leaving the giant circling helplessly in open water. At dawn on May 27th, the battleships HMS Rodney and HMS King George V, supported by cruisers and destroyers, caught up with their crippled prey. At close range, British guns pounded Bismarck relentlessly. Shell after shell tore through her decks and turrets. Fire and smoke engulfed the ship. The German crew fought back to the end, but resistance was hopeless. After more than an hour of punishment, Bismarck ceased fire, capsized, and began to sink. Captain Ernst Lindemann gave the order to scuttle the ship. Around 10 a.m., the once mighty battleship slipped beneath the waves. Of more than 2,200 crew, only about 110 survived. The symbol of German naval power was gone. From that moment, Hitler would never again risk his capital ships in the Atlantic. The burden fell once more on the U-boats. That summer, the United States' presence in the Atlantic became increasingly visible. Although not yet at war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the Navy to assist Britain wherever possible. American forces took over Iceland, establishing forward bases, and U.S. destroyers and patrol aircraft began escorting convoys in the western Atlantic. The first clashes between the U.S. Navy and German submarines soon followed. In September 1941, the destroyer USS Greer detected a U-boat and was attacked by torpedoes that missed their mark. The incident led Roosevelt to issue a shoot-on-sight order against any hostile submarines. Tensions escalated quickly. On October 31st, the destroyer USS Reuben James, while escorting a convoy, was struck by torpedoes from U-552 and exploded, killing 115 American sailors. Blood had been spilled on the Atlantic even before the United States officially entered the war. In early December 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on the Axis powers. From that moment, the Battle of the Atlantic entered a new phase, with America's full industrial and military strength joining Britain and the Allies in the fight for control of the seas. The year 1942 marked the peak expansion of the submarine war. With the United States officially entering the conflict, German U-boat commanders quickly shifted their focus to America's long-exposed coastline. In January 1942, Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, began. A small group of U-boats moved toward the U.S. East Coast. At night, from offshore, German captains were astonished by the lack of defenses. Coastal cities still blazed with light, silhouetting merchant ships against the bright skyline. The submarines chose their targets at will. One torpedo after another sped toward unsuspecting ships. Tankers and freighters burst into flames within sight of the American shore. Thick black smoke rose over the horizon, and for the first time, Americans watched the war reach their own doorstep. Throughout the winter and spring of 1942, the U.S. Atlantic coast became an open hunting ground for U-boats. From Newfoundland to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, Allied ships were attacked on an unprecedented scale. Every morning, American ports received grim reports. An oil tanker torpedoed off Virginia, a freighter burning near the Mississippi Delta, a merchant ship lost en route to Puerto Rico. Between January and June 1942, Allied shipping losses skyrocketed. Some months saw nearly 800,000 tons of cargo sunk, far outpacing new production. Allied leaders feared that the entire Atlantic supply line might collapse if this trend continued, but the U-boats' second happy time did not last. After a slow start, the U.S. Navy learned quickly. By June 1942, coastal convoys were organized and escorted systematically. Coastal cities dimmed their lights to make ships harder to spot. U.S. and Canadian aircraft expanded patrols across the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, reducing nearshore sinkings sharply in the latter half of the year. This forced the U-boats to move back into the mid-Atlantic, far beyond the range of land-based aircraft. There, in the vast open ocean, the wolf packs resumed their attacks on transatlantic convoys. By late 1942, the U-boat war had reached its height. More than 100 submarines operated simultaneously from the icy waters of Greenland to the warm seas off Brazil. Major convoy battles raged across the shipping lanes. Some convoys were nearly annihilated. Though both sides suffered losses, the U-boats still held the upper hand. Every month, hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied cargo and thousands of sailors were lost beneath the waves. Yet by the end of 1942, the balance began to shift. The Allies introduced new weapons and technologies, long-range radar on aircraft, HF/DF radio detection, and most importantly, escort carriers, small aircraft carriers equipped with fighters and bombers that accompanied convoys across the ocean. These floating airstrips became deadly threats to submarines forced to surface for air. Deep below, U-boat commanders could feel the change. The hunters were slowly becoming the hunted. The war at sea was moving into 1943, the decisive year when the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic would finally begin to turn. In 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic entered its most decisive phase. At the start of the year, Germany deployed an unprecedented number of U-boats, hoping to deliver a final blow to the Allied supply lines. Throughout the early spring, nearly every convoy crossing the ocean was shadowed by waiting wolf packs. In March 1943, Allied losses reached their peak. Within just 1 week, the large convoys HX-229 and SC-122 were ambushed by nearly 40 submarines. A chaotic battle raged for days and nights. 22 merchant ships were sunk, turning the mid-Atlantic into a floating graveyard of wreckage and lifeboats. Many sailors began to wonder whether the Atlantic route could survive at all. Yet this would prove to be the darkest hour before the dawn. By April and May 1943, the balance began to shift. The Allies had perfected their air and sea radar networks and closed the infamous air gap with B-24 Liberator long-range patrol bombers. Special anti-submarine hunter-killer groups, made up of destroyers and frigates, were now operating independently of convoys, hunting U-boats across the ocean. Escort carriers entered regular service, providing continuous air cover day and night. At the same time, Allied code breakers achieved a breakthrough. Having captured the Enigma machine and its key settings, they could now predict U-boat movements and reroute convoys to avoid ambushes. These combined efforts produced a dramatic turning point. In early May 1943, during the battle to protect convoy ONS-5, British and Canadian forces achieved a decisive victory. Guided by radar and HF/DF radio detection, escort ships counterattacked ferociously, dropping depth charges and firing on any submarine that surfaced. For the first time, the tide of losses reversed. 7 U-boats were destroyed or crippled, forcing the rest to retreat. The Battle of ONS-5 marked the beginning of the end for the U-boat campaign. May 1943 would go down in history as the Black May of the German submarine fleet. Over 40 U-boats destroyed and thousands of sailors lost in a single month. Shocked by the devastation, Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered the withdrawal of most U-boats from the North Atlantic by the end of May, effectively ending the blockade of Britain. From mid-1943 onward, the situation at sea was completely transformed. Massive convoys now crossed the Atlantic under dense protection both above and below. Allied patrol aircraft roamed constantly, ready to strike at the faint ripple of a periscope. Many submarines were destroyed soon after leaving their French bases, ambushed over the Bay of Biscay. The German Navy tried to adapt, introducing the snorkel breathing device that allowed diesel operation while submerged, and deploying the new T-5 acoustic torpedo designed to home in on escort ships. Initially, the T-5 claimed a few victims, but the Allies quickly countered with towed noise decoys to divert it. The technological duel continued, but the initiative had passed irreversibly to the Allies. By the end of 1943, Germany's naval situation was dire. The Scharnhorst, one of its last major surface warships, was sunk in the Battle of the North Cape. Other cruisers and destroyers remained trapped in port, crippled by fuel shortages and constant air raids. On the Atlantic front, the Third Reich had no remaining strategic weapon, only aging U-boats, increasingly ineffective in a sea and sky that no longer belonged to them. By 1944, the balance of power in the Atlantic had shifted completely in favor of the Allies. The number of escort ships, patrol aircraft, and escort carriers now vastly outnumbered the remaining German U-boats. Transatlantic convoys sailed with near impunity. In June 1944, the Allies launched the Normandy landings, assembling thousands of warships, landing craft, and transport vessels off the coast of France, something that would have been impossible had the U-boat threat not been subdued. At this stage, every submarine that ventured out faced death from all directions. Anti-submarine aircraft prowled above. Destroyers and frigates equipped with radar and sonar hunted below. Many U-boats never found a target before being destroyed in mid-ocean. Desperate for a miracle, the German High Command placed its hopes on a new generation of submarines, the Type 21 and Type 23. These boats could dive deeper, travel faster, and were far harder to detect than their predecessors. But by the time they entered service in late 1944, it was far too late to change the outcome of the war. Only a handful managed to put to sea, and most were forced to retreat or were sunk before achieving anything. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing on all fronts. Allied convoys now crossed the Atlantic like rivers of steel, carrying millions of troops and mountains of war supplies from the United States to Europe in preparation for the final blow. The few surviving U-boats operated sporadically, occasionally sinking an isolated ship, but these attacks were meaningless in the broader war. On May 4, 1945, from his last headquarters in northern Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz sent a final radio order to all remaining U-boats: cease hostilities and surrender to the Allies. Many submarines surfaced immediately, flying white or black flags in surrender. Others, unwilling to yield, opened their flood valves and scuttled their vessels beneath the waves. However they met their end, the long, brutal battle of the Atlantic was finally over. The vast ocean, once ablaze with war, grew silent again. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most grueling campaign of World War II, had ended in Allied victory, but at a terrible cost. The Allies lost 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships, over 36,000 merchant sailors and 36,200 naval personnel were killed. Germany's losses were catastrophic: 783 U-boats, nearly the entire fleet, and around 28,000 submariners, a staggering 75% casualty rate. The failure of Germany's U-boat campaign meant it could never sever the transatlantic lifeline. Britain, kept alive by that Atlantic lifeline, continued to receive food, weapons, and reinforcements from across the sea. This sustained flow of men and materiel made possible the liberation of Europe, as American power could safely reach British shores in preparation for the Second Front. The end of the battle confirmed the Allies' complete dominance over the Atlantic Ocean, paving the way for the final destruction of Nazi Germany and the ultimate end of World War II in 1945.